Good morning and welcome to the third meeting of 2026 in Session 6 of the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee. We have no apologies this morning. However, Rhoda Grant and Marie McNair are joining us remotely. This is also Rhoda's first meeting back with the committee, and we're very pleased to welcome you back, Rhoda. Our first agenda item this morning is continuation of our budget scrutiny for 2026-27. And I refer members to papers 1 and 2 and welcome to the meeting Shona Robson, Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Local Government, CoCab Stewart, Minister for Equalities. The Cabinet Secretary and Minister are accompanied by Simon Fuller, Deputy Director for Fiscal Strategy and Analysis, and Rob Priestley, Head of the Scottish Government's Mainstreaming Unit. You're all very welcome this morning. Thank you for attending. I invite the Cabinet Secretary and the Minister to give short opening statements before we then move on to questions.
Well, morning everyone. Thanks, Convener, and thanks for the opportunity to return and speak to you today. So first of all, let me say that the budget and the spending review reflect our priorities and values as a government. And I'm very proud of the choices we've made with fairness at their heart, that we ensure that every pound of public money spent delivers the greatest possible benefit for the people of Scotland, set against, of course, a backdrop of constrained resources and a rising demand for public services. The budget invests almost £68 billion to secure a fair, healthy, safe, prosperous and green society for the Scottish people. As we navigate this challenging economic and fiscal environment, we also have a duty to ensure our decisions advance equality and protect the most vulnerable. Our ambition is to make sure every policy decision improves lives for those who need it most across Scotland. On the 19th of January, we published our first strategic integrated impact assessment of the likely impacts of the budget, the spending review and the infrastructure delivery pipeline decisions on people in Scotland. This new approach brings all impact assessments together into a single process and publication to provide a more holistic and more transparent view of fiscal decisions. This approach has been developed in collaboration with international experts and key stakeholders in Scotland, such as the Equalities and Human Rights Budget Advisory Group and the National Advisory Council on Women and Girls. I'm pleased that SPICE has acknowledged some, quote, significant improvements with this new approach, a more accessible document, better use of data, stronger links between our aims and our spending, and open recognition of unmet targets, and that this document does more than any before to address past concerns. Our analysis shows that the Scottish budget redistributes from high-income households to those further down the income distribution through both the tax and social security system and through the delivery of public services. Overall, the decisions taken at the budget, spending review and the infrastructure delivery pipeline are expected to have a positive or neutral impact across the 5 statutory duties considered. This year's publication also improves budget transparency, so for the first time we show the impacts of spending decisions as well as the implications of constrained or reduced resources for disadvantaged groups, including the trade-offs involved and the mitigations considered. The report also presents new and emerging findings from enhanced distributional analysis and pilot activity on budget tagging and intersectional analysis. This evidence was actively used throughout all stages of the process to inform decision-making, including for the third year running in a cross-ministerial pre-budget workshop. So I'm very grateful to the Minister for Equalities for her continued support and challenge in these important meetings, and we intend to evaluate the new approach and will publish the results later this year. Finally, to help today's session run smoothly, I just want to note the need for us to have a fairly hard stop at 11:30 because we are joining the Cabinet takeover with disabled people, an important engagement reflecting Scotland's leadership in placing lived experience at the heart of decision making, and we're both looking forward to joining that event. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and thank you, the committee and convener, for the opportunity to return today. I value the committee's continued engagement and scrutiny. That scrutiny matters because embedding equality, inclusion and human rights into budget decisions and across government is core business. It's not a one-off task. It requires sustained leadership, strong capability and clear accountability for both decisions and outcomes. I believe we have shown this throughout this year's budget. As the Minister for Equalities, I am clear about my responsibility. I'm personally accountable for driving the mainstreaming of equality and human rights across government, and that means providing visible leadership, setting clear expectations and supporting and, of course, where necessary, challenging ministerial colleagues to ensure these considerations are built into decision-making from the outset, directly influencing decisions, not added on afterwards. To strengthen delivery, I've worked collaboratively with the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Local Government and with colleagues across portfolios. Through one-to-one engagement and earlier ministerial involvement in the budget process, we are deliberately changing how we work. The focus is now on upfront assessment of impacts, clearer articulation of the trade-offs and more transparent explanation of decisions. That shift is essential if we want equality and human rights are to be at the shape rather than just simply to describe budget decisions. The recently published Equality and Human Rights Mainstreaming Strategy Action Plan is a key enabler of this change. It moves us beyond aspiration by setting out practical, measurable actions to strengthen leadership, improve accountability and transparency, and to better align evidence, capability and culture. By bringing the actions together in a simple framework, it improves the consistency across portfolios, it sharpens the accountability for progress and supports earlier, more systematic consideration of impacts so that resources are targeted where we can make the biggest difference. We've already made improvements to how evidence informs budget decisions and have also improved how those decisions are communicated, informed by the Equality Human Rights Budget Advisory Group and, of course, the committee's recommendations. And as the committee, as the Cabinet Secretary has already stated, SPICE have acknowledged these improvements and they've also noted that the overall approach shows the clear link between strategic aims and spending that stakeholders have been asking for. However, I'm not complacent. There is absolutely more to do, and I remain committed to listening, learning and continuous improvement, working with this committee and stakeholders to strengthen transparency, accountability and outcomes for the people of Scotland. Thank you, Convener.
Okay. Thank you for those opening statements. We're now going to move on to questions, and I'll just remind members to be cognisant of the time. Particularly, we don't want to curb the takeover of government from people with lived experience. So just be mindful that we don't cut into other members' question and time. I'm going to start us off and ask the Minister, can you explain the changes to the Equality, Inclusion and Human Rights budget?
The changes, well, sort of like as I outlined in my opening remarks, the changes that we have made, I believe that they demonstrate more transparency, and that's been recognised. We are spending £72 million to promote equality, tackle discrimination and foster inclusion and embed human rights across public sector to deliver better outcomes for all of Scotland's people. So there has been some reprofiling of level 4 lines to reflect that restructuring rather than substantive budget changes. So I can give you some examples. The refugee and resettlement line has replaced the Ukrainian resettlement line. It now includes the cost of the new Scots strategy being taken forward by Asylum and Refugee Integration Team, who sit alongside the Ukrainian teams in that division. So we've committed over £12 million to deliver the new Scots integration strategy and supporting families who have children that are medically evacuated from Gaza, and supporting Ukrainians who have sought safety in Scotland. Similarly, the Mainstreaming and Inclusion Division line has been amended to include AROS, the costs for that, as the Strategic Anti-Racism and AROS team were moved from the Equality Division to sit under the M&I. And also the Disability Equality Plan costs were moved from the Equality Division to the Human Rights Division, as the Disability team and their work were moved in this year. So for all these areas, the total operating costs, for instance staffing costs, have been recalculated to reflect the new structure.
Thank you, Minister. Now move on to questions from Maggie Chapman, please.
Thanks very much, Karen, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary, Minister. Thank you for joining us this morning. Just following on from the convener's questions, I suppose I'm interested in understanding, in the analysis you've done, the restructuring that you've just described, Minister. How confident are you, or what is the evidence that restructuring is actually going to deliver improved impact?
Well, can I bring... Yeah, I'd like to bring Rob in here.
Sure. I mean, the restructuring the Minister referred to is very much an internal civil service process of realigning just the reporting lines and the reporting teams in place, rather than a change to the delivery methodology approach. What it did do is make sure that we've done some key alignment of work. For example, the Minister spoke about realigning AROS and anti-racism within mainstreaming and inclusion. Mainstreaming and inclusion includes community cohesion as an area of work. So there are some areas of alignment to pieces of work there as well to make sure that lines up. But primarily it's an internal process about ensuring that we've got the staffing, the right management structures in place. Okay,
so we might not see any tangible benefits for communities. It's about that sort of the management, the oversight of, and integration. Sort of cross-portfolio or cross-departmental working? Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, certainly when you say the benefits, I mean, everything that we do, to reassure you, is with that aim in mind. And sometimes that means that we have to realign and, take those decisions so that things fit together better, things run smoothly, that communication, the integration and the mainstreaming, which I, am constantly sort of trying to embed across. So as Rob says, it's an internal sort of civil service, they realign their departments to make sure that my expectations are realised to the best effect and to the most efficiency. And that process will be evaluated. It's always evaluated to make sure that it is, in fact, having the impact that we want it to have. So the ultimate aim is that it will benefit communities.
Okay. Okay. If I can shift to speaking about a couple of particular funds and particular lines. The Equality and Human Rights Fund has for a long time provided really, really important support across race, disability, LGBTQIA+, age, a whole range of different organisations, fundamental to, I think, the government's aims of improving equalities and human rights across Scotland. But it's been flat cash for 5 years, and that's effectively a 25% cut over those 5 years. We've had representation from BEMIS and 27 other organisations working together who deliver the services that this fund supports. And they are really, really concerned that this ongoing flat cash settlement, actually, because of the reflected cut in real terms, they are not going to be able to do what they've been doing for the last 5 years. And so we won't see the outcomes that you've just been talking about. We won't see the improving equality, the fostering inclusion, those kinds of aims and aspirations that you have, because actually they can't sustain a 25% cut in real terms. How do you answer that challenge?
Yeah, I mean, I recognise that. I think we all recognise that we are operating under very difficult circumstances financially, and I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary can sort of develop that further and give a more detailed picture and bigger picture on that. The Equality and Human Rights Fund, it does serve a really important role, and I absolutely recognise that the organisations funder, that we fund through that, deliver that vital sort of support. And, I just want to put it on record that we absolutely value and appreciate the work that they do. But despite the increasing challenges, our partners in the third sector, they continue to provide essential support to communities across Scotland. And I do absolutely value that. Scottish public finances, continue to face challenging fiscal environment, with public services having to meet growing demand despite increasingly challenging settlements. And I know that the government has been consistently clear on the extent of the challenges that are faced, with successive budgets and medium-term financial strategies highlighting the choices and the trade-offs, which I mentioned in my opening remarks, that are necessary to deliver a balanced and sustainable position. I don't know if the Cabinet Secretary would like to come in at that point. Or...
Yeah, of course. I mean, in addition to what the Minister has said, we have, as you'll be aware, attempted through the Fairer Funding pilot to give certainty to third sector organisations. Not all are part of the Fairer Funding pilot, obviously, but it is an attempt to move to the certainty of funding on a multi-year basis versus quantum. Is quite often what organisations will say is that stability and certainty enables them to hold on to staff and to plan what they're going to do. And in the environment of constrained finances, moving to that certainty and multi-year funding, I think is our attempt to recognise some of the issues that have been raised around that continuity of service, holding on to staff and so on. I mean, there is a challenge back to third sector organisations as well, which we have given and will continue to give, that we need to move away from what you might kind of see as a competitive environment for funding towards a more collaborative approach to funding. So third sector organisations coming together to work together and to share some of those back office resources rather than all competing for the same funding.
I can appreciate that, but I suppose, Cabinet Secretary, that's precisely the point. And the letter that I know you've had and the correspondence that committee has received it's quite clear. These are 27 organisations working together. They are collaborating. They are not competing with each other. They're quite clear that they don't want to play one organisation off against the other. They're looking for a 2.3 million uplift. So that takes the fund from 8 million to 10.3 million, and that's you talk about quantum. That is less than 0.004% of the 68 billion you mentioned at the start of your contribution. And I think given the work they do, given the challenges, I understand the fiscal challenges, but we're also seeing people really struggling, whether that's due to the cost of living, whether that's due to increased racial tensions on our streets, whether that's due to actually not having the services that are required. We know that the third sector goes way over and above what they actually have the resources to deliver. Surely that 2.3 million is a small price to pay on that collaborative, cooperative basis for these organisations delivering such vital work. And if they don't do the work, that will then fall onto the public sector to pick up the pieces when things go wrong, probably in criminal justice, probably in areas that are actually detrimental to communities and individuals.
Well, look, I'm not unsympathetic to the point you're making. We have these discussions with just about every sector, and my colleagues in Cabinet have the same discussions, and it is, and I take your point about the value of the uplift compared to the overall budget, but you could times those discussions, hundreds of times over with the various organisations that are working in our communities, particularly our third sector partners. And what we've tried to do is to bring stability and certainty as much as we can to those organisations. And I do recognise the point that you make about some organisations in the third sector have moved towards working together to share resources and have those economies of scale and efficiencies, which we need to see. But the bottom line is we can only provide what we can provide, and but we'll continue to have those discussions with those organisations, and we'll monitor. And we'll take that commitment away to monitor the position with their ability to deliver within the financial envelope that they have.
I mean, I think if you could take away a slightly expanded commitment to look seriously at this, because you talked about the values and priorities of the Scottish Government, one of them being fairness, and if these organisations are delivering such important community cohesion work, never mind the nuts and bolts of the remit of this committee, which is equalities and human rights. I think that would be very valuable. My final question on this area is, Cabinet Secretary, you talked about the certainty of funding and the importance of multi-year funding, and I think it's very, very good. It's very positive that we've seen that shift. So thank you for that. I think that'll give a lot of people that security that you talked about. However, there are still some that feel, I think, quite vulnerable, and maybe, again, another particular fund, the Investing in Communities Fund, that delivers important community cohesion, anti-poverty work as well. I wrote to you on the 7th of January about this fund, and I know Richard Lochhead announced in the Chamber last week some comfort, but organisations still don't actually have the detail, a line in a letter that says there will be some funding for some organisations for up to the next financial year, isn't enough for them to not enter into redundancy conversations with staff. So I would ask if there can be clarity on what that means sooner rather than later. That gives that certainty that you are talking about to this fund that's not got that multi-year security.
Well, let me assure you that discussions are absolutely ongoing and imminent around that level of detail to be provided, because I do recognise that people want to know, well, what does that mean, and what certainty does it give. So we're going to aim to provide that as quickly as we can, because we do appreciate, we want to avoid any loss of staff within those organisations that are providing important support to communities across Scotland. So I'll give you that assurance. Happy to make sure that the committee, when the information's coming into the public domain, that we furnish the committee
that would be helpful.
That
Thank
information.
You. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you. We now have questions from Tess White.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary, Minister. So if I first start off with the Cabinet Secretary in my question, and then if I go to you, Minister, and then I go back to the Cabinet Secretary. So my question is about, from the Cabinet Secretary's perspective, what impact has the new strategic integrated impact assessments approach had on the budget process? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think, as I said in my opening remarks, I think the new approach to impact assessments has enabled the equality and human rights evidence to shape decisions earlier and more effectively than before. So I guess rather than directing the analytical effort towards producing perhaps what was perceived previously a bit of a lengthy document at the end of the cycle. The new approach really focuses the resources on generating insight at the moments when it can genuinely influence choices. So when decisions are being made. And that shift has allowed us to, I think, to take better informed decisions for all three fiscal events. So the evidence gathered, including the lessons from the pilot activities, was actively used at every stage of the budget process, and that included, for example, integrating impact analysis directly into ministerial advice at key decision points, so ministers would have that in front of them, and also providing structured briefing for the ministerial workshop in November that had a particular focus on eradicating child poverty and sustaining high quality public services. And we also ensured that the emerging assessment was shared at critical junctures in the process, so including cabinet discussions, which were really important for sign-off. And that meant that ministers were able to consider distributional, equality and rights-based impacts alongside the fiscal, economic and delivery factors when making decisions, so able to see all of that in the round. So I guess in summary, it has helped make the budget process more evidence-driven, more coherent and better aligned. So yeah, I think it's been positive.
Thank you. And I'm going to now drill down on one specific line item, Minister, and it's line item 31. Violence against women and girls. So I hear you, transparency, accountability and spend, and this is the first time that it's brought these together in one place. So it's easier to sort of come back and ask questions. On the violence against women and girls, there is a score of 1, which is exceptional. So I'm looking at the sheets in front of me.
Okay.
And you've got, basically it says, you've got scores of exceptional, 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 positive, positive, exceptional, exceptional. And so when I look at that, for the performance on equality and human rights for women, but given the current reality for women and girls in Scotland, there seems to be a disconnect. So maybe is that you're looking at the fund and saying the fund for those 100 or so organisations that you're giving the money to, that it's having, you view that it's exceptional then? Or are you actually looking at the outcomes of violence against women and girls? So I'd just like to understand that in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think what you're referring to is the Excel files were published which do the budget tagging. And yep, exactly. And as you say, what they're doing is across multiple level 4s is evaluating against key characteristics. So what we're saying in the context of the Violence Against Women and Girls Fund is this is seen as exceptional insofar as it's seen as a really important budget line and mechanism to deliver a number of our key equalities outcomes. So it's very much saying this is, what it's trying to do is flag, but this is a budget line which we think is particularly important, exceptional, for meeting these objectives.
That's true, but if you look at the outcomes of violence against women and girls, and this committee has had debates in the Parliament fairly recently, and we looked at evidence compiled by the Women's Rights Network on sexual assaults in hospitals, the lack of single-sex wards, lengthy waits for rape support services, and the wider deterioration of women's safety and rights. Yet it looks as though the spreadsheet, line item 31, violence against women and girls, which is accepted that it's, and as I say, we've had huge debates, we've had several committee sessions on it, and it's misleading to say that it's exceptional, exceptional, exceptional. So I just put it to you that you might want to revisit that when you're looking at the outcomes. And if I go back to what the Cabinet Secretary and the Minister said at the start, the Cabinet Secretary said safe, prosperous and green society and protect the most vulnerable. If you look at the protections for the most vulnerable, there are many organisations out there who would not score you exceptional. So I just want to say that.
So
Cabinet
I think
Secretary.
So I think there's the description of exceptional isn't to say that, you know, all of the delivery and the outcomes are all exceptional. It's to say that the budget line is exceptionally important because of the impact that it will have on the and disproportionate benefit for priority groups most affected. And if that funding line wasn't there, it would have a major impact on those affected. So then we've got the whole debate around, you know, the societal pressures and all of the issues that impact on the safety of women and girls, whether it's, you know, from misogyny to social media and so now, you know, funding budget lines are not going to in themselves be able to tackle all of those societal challenges, but without those budget lines the impact would be disproportionately negative on those particularly priority groups, whether it's women and girls on that line of funding or whether it's you know, those benefiting from employability on another line. So it's not to describe the outcomes as exceptional, it's to describe the importance of the budget line for those groups. Is that?
Yes.
Am I
hear you, Cabinet Secretary, and thank you for that explanation. The organisations, when they're looking at this, are just going, oh my goodness, the Scottish Government is marking its own homework and saying, so thank you for that clarification. Now, my next question is around, because the links here from this budget sheet and people are looking at that in terms of the outcomes. And only last week, there's a debate going on that was started off in the Education Committee. And one of the criticisms of the Equalities Fund is that it's very siloed and doesn't work across the different Cabinet Secretary portfolios. So the one that was raised last week, and it was on the 21st of January, about the Scottish Government funding of LGBT Youth Scotland. So I'd like the Cabinet Secretary to confirm whether she is content that, because you said that every pound, I think you said every pound spent has to have the greatest possible benefit. So I agree with you there. So can you confirm whether you are content for the public money that's spent on LGBT Youth Scotland to go to an organisation that helped draft supporting transgender pupils in schools guidance, despite professional warnings of safeguarding risks, parental exclusion, legal exposure for schools, and in the light of fresh safeguarding allegations now facing LGBT Youth Scotland? Is that money well spent, Cabinet Secretary?
If I remember rightly, I think you asked exactly the same question last year, and I think the answer I gave and the Minister gave will be the same, that the elements of what organisations, whether it's that organisation or any other organisation, are funded from the Scottish Government are for specific programmes, and the Minister will outline in more detail what those specific programmes are. So, you know, there are many organisations that will be funded for specific things around, you know, mental health, around whatever the funding is for. It won't just be for general funding for an organisation. And, you know, I think that has to be done in a bit of a dispassionate way, because otherwise we just get into a political bun fight about which organisations we like and which organisations we don't like for our own political views. And I don't think that's right. I think we should look at which organisations provide services to vulnerable people who need them and what those services are, without passing judgment on something you don't like about a particular organisation. But CoCab, do you want to talk about the specifics that that organisation provides?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, generally, you know, just to reiterate that that funding, it sort of like helps to ensure that all vulnerable groups continue to receive support. They get information and they get advocacy, and all of that has to be undertaken within the framework of the law. So to make it clear, as I have done to the committee before when I've been asked the same question, third sector organisations are not funded by us to promote this government's views at all. We fund them specifically to provide services to vulnerable people and communities. All our grant offer letters specify that funds are not to be used for any party political reasons or any other. Now, many organisations, they undertake other work. And I'm not going to name any other organisations because inevitably it leads to pylons. It brings attention, as it does to this particular organisation quite frequently. What they do and how they raise their money for those other things, my concern, this government's concern, is to procure specific things. And I have mentioned before that I have visited LGBT Scotland recently myself. I have spoken to the young people, I have spoken to parents, I have spoken to staff. And the advocacy, the information that they are receiving through the services that we specifically pay for, and I can't speak to anything else, only that we pay for, that has literally been life-saving for some. It has literally saved their lives, including sort of support with folks that might have suicide ideation, for instance, getting access to healthcare. All of that kind of stuff is going on. So, especially at a time when you know, the trans communities are under enormous scrutiny, being 0.44% of the population, and heightened debate in public discourse and all the rest of it. So actually, I would understand if people were asking for increased funding, considering the demand is increasing because of the increasing vulnerability and attacks on the trans community. So the demand is increasing. I
hear you. And are you doing your own safeguarding and due diligence checks on organisations that you're giving funding to?
So we have, I always get confused now, is it Aspire? Inspire, yes, I always get that wrong, forgive me. So Inspire are our fund managers, and they undertake all of that, all the proper scrutiny that is to be undertaken is undertaken by them, and we follow that due diligence.
But I'm saying your accountability and the Cabinet Secretary's accountability. You can't delegate accountability for health and safety. So are you satisfied that every pound that you're spending of the government money, taxpayer money, is being spent wisely and properly, and you've done your own safeguarding checks?
Well, we don't personally go out and do safeguarding checks. That would be impossible for ministers to. We oversee it through the organisation that the Minister has just referred to, who do the work because they're closer to the organisations in terms of the knowledge of the detail. But if there were any concerns to be flagged, then of course those would be flagged, and they would have to meet all of the criteria that every single organisation requires to meet when they're receiving public money. But, you know, it is possible to not like an organisation for your own reasons, but to recognise the important work that they carry out in supporting young people who are suicidal and, you know, potentially could take their own lives. So, you know, I think it is possible to separate out those two issues and to recognise that without those services, young people would be very, very much more vulnerable and potentially at risk. So I think it is possible to, you know, to do that. And
I think, Cabinet Secretary, it's not a question of whether like or dislike. When the head of Children in Need steps down, when only last week in the Sunday Post there was huge concerns regarding safeguarding relating to a particular organisation, then I'm saying, is it your responsibility and accountability to make sure when there are significant concerns raised in the national press about an organisation that the Scottish Government is funding, do you feel that you have accountability and responsibility over that spend? what I've heard just now is no, it goes through delegated to Inspiring Scotland.
Well, that's not what was said at all. What was said was if there were any concerns, they would be flagged with ministers and that could put their funding in jeopardy. But we rely on other organisations to give us that information. Otherwise, COCAB and I would be spending 24/7 visiting organisations personally. We can't do that.
That's fine. So, we'll give you a copy of the Sunday Post. Thank you.
Well, and I'm sure we'll appreciate that. But as you will be aware, we have very robust mechanisms in place that would flag any concerns about an organisation that would require us to revisit funding, for example. But COCAB, I don't know if you want to...
Yeah, no, I was just going to clarify. Are you referring to sort of like historical? I mean, I don't know the...
well, there's the... I think I've taken up enough time. I think we'll send you the article in the Sunday Post. I'll write to you separately. And then my question is, I would ask you, pending a review and an investigation, would you consider withdrawing funding? I will leave that with you and I'll pass it back to the convener.
I don't think that's fair on an organisation to basically at a committee session ask for us to review and potentially withdraw funding from an organisation. So I'm not going to commit to that at all. What I would say is if any concerns have been flagged through Inspiring Scotland, then that would come to us. Those are the proper processes that are undertaken around any organisation's funding and delivery of service. So if the funding that we provide for a service, it's not for the organisation and all of its work it does, but for a particular service, and there were concerns about that service, the way it's provided, any concerns about young people getting that service or anybody else getting that service, then of course that would be flagged to ministers. But I think we have to be fair to organisations here around. You're referring to an article in a newspaper. Sometimes articles in newspapers don't always tell the whole story about an organisation and the particular services that they provide. But if there was a service that we fund and there were concerns about that service, then of course we would take the necessary action.
Thank you. We now have questions from Pam Gossel and then Paul McLennan, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister and Cabinet Secretary and officials. I've got a question behind, obviously, my colleague Tess, but I just want to obviously make an observation, but also highlight something that I have, Minister, highlighted with you before about LGBT Youth Scotland. I heard that you said you've spoke to parents. I'd like you to come to East Dunbartonshire, if you can, and listen to the concerns of parents there, which now are, watch this space, they will be taking further. And, you're not listening to newspapers, you're talking about yourself and Cabinet Secretary, what we dislike. This has nothing to do with what we dislike an organisation. It's about facts out there, but also it'd be really good if you could, if you're visiting parents, if you could visit East Dunbartonshire. I'm quite happy to pass on those details, and if you could speak to those parents groups that are very concerned with this organisation, that would be much appreciated. And you could hear firsthand where the concerns are, if that's okay with yourself, Minister.
Well, look, if there are any concerns from anybody about an organisation, we would expect those concerns to be listened to. And, I'm sure that can be picked up through the intermediaries to hear those organisations. But what you've described is a very vague thing about parents in your East Dunbartonshire. Beyond that, I don't know what that refers to, whether it's a particular service that they're concerned about that we fund, or is it just a general concern about an organisation. I think, just to reiterate, the funding we provide are for specific services. So COCAB mentioned services that are saving young people's lives who are suicidal. So if the parents have a concern about that particular service that we fund to vulnerable young people potentially facing suicide, then of course we would want to know what those concerns are, as opposed to a general unspecified concern about an organisation. So let's hear what it is through, if you want to write to us, I'm sure that the Minister and potentially the intermediaries could follow up on those concerns. But in the absence of knowing what any of that is, I think, we would need to know the specifics.
Okay. That's fine, I will write to you, but I have written to the Government, and the concern is with directly LGBT Youth Scotland, not any other organisation, so that I can make that clear. But happy to write to you, Cabinet Secretary and Minister. Minister and Cabinet Secretary, you claim that your government is doing a good job when it comes to the protection of women and girls, but time and time again we have seen the number of domestic abuse incidents rising, organisations combating domestic abuse and sexual crimes being starved of funding, and today the Scottish Government will be defending its unlawful prisons policy, which puts the rights of male criminals above those of women. So how can you claim, through the strategic integrated impact assessment, that the Scottish Government is committed to making Scotland a leader in equality and human rights?
Okay, so let me first say that this Parliament has a strong tradition on a cross-party basis of tackling and taking the most serious action on domestic abuse. Right from the get-go, from when this Parliament was established in 1999, tackling domestic abuse and tackling violence against women and girls has been of the utmost priority on a cross-party basis. And a lot of work has been done, whether that's through legislation, and that continues. There's still important pieces of legislation that protect victims of domestic abuse. And that is really, really important, and it's good that it's been taken forward on a cross-party basis. In terms of the funding for violence against women and girls, we have had a long tradition of providing funding that goes to frontline organisations to protect women and girls, and that funding is continuing, and I think actually as part of the fairer funding pilot, but I will double check that, but I think it is, yes. Because we recognise, thank you, because we recognise that multi-year funding of support for to tackle violence against women and girls is really important. But I guess the last thing I would want to say is that violence against women and girls is a global scourge that is affecting women and girls all over the world because of misogyny, because of social media, because of the power imbalance. All of these things are absolutely huge enablers of misogyny that every government is trying to tackle. And we, as a government, are absolutely trying to tackle it. And if you look at the number of cases coming through the criminal courts, it would suggest, because of the exponential rise in the number of cases coming through, particularly of sexual offences, it does suggest that actually our prosecutors and our police force are very, very active in this space to make sure that the victims of domestic abuse and sexual violence have got more chance now of the perpetrators facing the consequences that they should face. And that is why the courts are absolutely full of cases coming through, because that action quite rightly has been taken to send a very, very important message. The Lord Advocate, I can tell you for one, is very, very active in this space. So, are we, sitting on our laurels saying that, we're complacent and everything's fine? Absolutely not. It is, as a mother of a daughter, I can tell you it is one of the things that absolutely terrifies me because of the levels of misogyny in our country and in beyond our borders. It is pervasive and something that our government takes very, very seriously, but complacent we are absolutely not.
No, and in fact, I just wanted to sort of highlight that we did actually increase the funding to delivering Equally Safe by 2.4 million, which actually brought it up to 21.6 million. Obviously, that's subject to the approval of the budget. So, just to ensure that we are sort of recognising the increased need there. And I'd just like to confirm that it is part of our commitment to that fairer budget, fairer funding approach. Because I heard very loudly and clearly that sort of like, you know, people are wanting that multi-year funding in order to stabilise the services, stabilise the workforce, all the rest of it. I mean, it is very frustrating when we do announce uplifts and then it's taken away. The effect of that isn't as much as we would like it to be, because then we get an increase in national insurance contributions. So it's, you know, it's the ultimate frustration there. But I would just like to reiterate that, you know, many debates in Parliament, many works of highlight, and you know, the amount of organisations. I mean, we currently support 115 projects, and that's from like 107 organisations which cover every local authority in Scotland.
Yeah, so more funding, multi-year, more services being provided, but of course that only happens if people vote for the budget to put it in place.
Convener, I know I've got questions under 12, but I think they fit best under what I've started. Is it possible if I can just ask those two questions now, or would you? Because it just fits in what we're talking.
Then we'll go to Paul and then Rhoda.
Thank you, Convener. I do welcome, first of all, multi-year funding. I think that's definitely a good idea that special organisations can plan better. My question is around the total number of women and children experiencing domestic abuse in my area of West Dumbartonshire who asked for help rose by 7.59% to 1,729 in just 1 year. West Dumbartonshire is the second local authority in Scotland with the most incidents of domestic abuse per 10,000 people. Once again, there is a lack of sustainable funding when it comes to services in violence against women and girls sector, meaning that many vulnerable lives are being put at risk. The First Minister and his colleagues keep banging on, and today as well you've been talking about supposedly the great work the SNP government has been doing, but figures are showing an absolutely different picture here. And you know, I've heard that you're funding Equally Safe and everything, but you can't possibly sit there, Cabinet Secretary and Minister, and say that figures rising is a good thing here. I've talked about basically overall figures rising in domestic abuse year after year. I've now spoken about directly my area figures rising. So it would be good to hear from yourselves that not just are you feeling my constituents, but you're actually feeling the whole of Scotland when it comes down to domestic abuse incidents being reported rising.
Right, so nobody said that it was a good thing that domestic abuse cases are rising. Nobody said that. Domestic abuse is a scourge on our society and has been for many years. And the reason that domestic abuse cases are rising is because misogyny is rising and men think it's okay to take their, you know, to be violent towards women and girls. That is a global phenomenon, not just here in Scotland. And it is something that should deeply, deeply concern us. And the domestic abuse cases rising is a symptom of that. There are, of course, more women coming forward now, because back in my day when I was growing up, women didn't come forward because they were scared to. There was no support, and their issues were not taken seriously by law enforcement. That has changed, thankfully, and the reason I referred earlier on to the number of cases coming through the courts, a huge exponential growth in cases of domestic violence and sexual assault, is because more cases are coming forward and are then being prosecuted by the authorities. And as I said earlier, the Lord Advocate has been very, very active in this area. So that in itself sends out a message to women that they should come forward. And of course, we have a range of support organisations that back in the day were just not there. So the funding that we provide, more funding, as the Minister said, is there to support those organisations, to support women, to make sure that they are supported through what can, with all the improvements that have been made to the court processes and the reporting processes, it can still be a very, very challenging experience for women to come forward. So these organisations that are providing that absolutely critical support have now got more funding and multi-year funding through Fairer Scotland. Is there more to do? Absolutely. And as I started off my answer to this area of questioning, I think this Parliament has done a lot of very, very good work on a cross-party basis of making sure that the law is changed. Just recently, there is now support for women who are fleeing domestic violence, and this turned on its head the attitude where women were the ones who had to leave the home, and all of that. There has been a sea change of attitudinal change, but at the same time we have a rise in misogyny through all of the ways that we fully understand. So, I am proud that we have a Parliament that's taken this issue so seriously, and the money that we provide is important, but it's only one part of the answer. And, as I say, that is one of our very important areas of the budget that has been given more money and the certainty for these organisations on a multi-year basis. And I know some of them are able then to plan more effectively for the work that they're doing.
I mean, it's absolutely clear here. Incidents are rising and they are being reported, right? So there is a system failure somewhere with the government. Things are not working.
So what do you mean by that?
What I'm saying is basically incidents are rising year after year. You're talking about you're providing certain funds for certain areas, but these organisations, including in Western Barnshire, you probably know Women's Aid in Clydebank when they seized as well. Basically, even local authorities getting the money to put out as well. But the fact that there is an issue here that these organisations aren't being funded, and that's why the system is failing. And we know incidents are going up year after year, whether it's locally in my area and whether it's nationally. But I want to give you another example, Cabinet Secretary, about another organisation, and then hopefully you can shed some light on how you're working with this organisation. Glasgow and Clyde Rape Crisis is Scotland's largest rape crisis centre, serving 6 local authority areas and making contact with at least 40,000 rape and sexual violence victims each year. However, it only receives an eighth of the funding allocated towards Rape Crisis Scotland. Inadequate funding puts the service at risk of closure, putting thousands of women at risk. Cabinet Secretary and Minister, these are some of the most vulnerable women in our society who are, scarred for life by these horrendous crimes. If Glasgow and Clyde were to cease operating, would the Scottish Government accept the blame?
So, first of all, as I said earlier, the cases that are rising of domestic abuse and of sexual crimes are not rising because of the money that the government gives to organisations. They're rising across most countries in the world because of the rise in misogyny. We see that exponential growth, but also our law enforcement and our prosecutors have got better at making sure these cases come forward and are going through the courts. That in turn encourages more women to come forward. So, as I've described, back in the day, that was not the case. Now more women are coming forward and more successful prosecutions are being seen, thankfully. In terms of the support to Glasgow Rape Crisis Centre, we would expect the funding that we provide through Rape Crisis Scotland to be distributed through that. We'll have a look at what the proportion is that goes to Glasgow Rape Crisis as a proportion of the overall funding. I would just make this point, though. Every single pound that goes to rape crisis services or Women's Aid or other services on the front line that comes from the increased funding, not less funding, but more funding that we're providing in this area, it can only actually get to those organisations if the budget passes and people support the budget. And I would just leave that thought there, that if people don't vote for a budget that provides additional funding for violence against women, then that puts at risk the funding for violence against women to all of those organisations. But we will look at what the proportion is, I don't know, COCAB, if you're aware of the distribution from the rate crisis fund.
I don't have the figures of the breakdown because there are many rape crisis centres around the country, so I don't have the breakdown of that. But I can just give you that reassurance of, one, the increased funding, and two, the multi-year funding, because that's been the biggest issue that has been raised to me by rape crisis centres, is the more sustainable funding, and that's what we are acting on. And I just wanted to sort of reiterate some of the Cabinet Secretary's views. You mentioned the word sort of failure with an increase in reporting. I would have thought that mechanisms that have increased reporting is some sign of success, that women are able to come back, to come forward and to report and to have a faith in a system. So it is more responsive. And there are many elements to this. And what we mustn't do is, in a bid to sort of apportion blame, is to forget where the blame actually lies. And it lies in that deep-rooted misogynistic behaviours. And that is where we need to be looking at. So the rise in domestic violence is just absolutely appalling across the world. And that is not the blame of governments. That is the blame of misogynistic, abusive behaviour and coercive control that is demonstrated by men. So we must remember that.
Can I just come back?
I'm just cognisant of the time, and I did say we'll have to be mindful of other members. So we have to go to Paul, and then we'll be going and moving on to Rhoda.
Okay. Clarify something or no?
Well, we need to move on to Paul to the question, and because we have a hard stop at 11:30.
Okay, I mean, you know that this is a big issue that I really, Convener, wanted to speak more about this, obviously, and, having a response like that and not to go back, but that's fine. If there is no time, that's fine.
Thank you. Paul.
Thank you, Convener. And just, I'm cognizant of time. I'm going to ask a question, but I can't let the last two questions go past without comment. And I think that the really important thing, I think, for me is, in terms of my time as Housing Minister, I talked about the fund to leave and also the housing bill and the issues that I brought forward around about domestic abuse. In my time as an MSP, I had various cross-party round tables and spoken 16 days of activism a couple of days. And it's quite right in what the Minister and the Cabinet Secretary is saying here. This is about misogyny. This is about men's behaviour. Full stop, about men's behaviour. It's a cultural thing as well. So I think we've got to recognise that. Government is doing what it needs to do, and there's a problem right across the world because of increased misogyny. This is a problem for men. It impacts on women, of course, but this is a problem about men's behaviour. And I think that I can't let that comment go past without saying something around about that. No, but I think it's a point that I wanted to make.
I don't think she's speaking to me, no.
Right. The question I wanted to ask was obviously, in bringing us back to the strategic integrated impact assessment, it was obviously about the review of that, because obviously it's a new approach, and it's obviously looking at when that is going to be reviewed and how do we expect it every budget round. So it's really just on in terms of what a review looks like in terms of the new approach for this budget round, and obviously next budget round as well, in terms of what that looks like.
Yep. So So the timing of the review, as set out in the Equalities and Human Rights Mainstreaming Action Plan, we remain committed to publishing a full process evaluation of the new approaches in early this year. And the work to evaluate both the strategic integrated impact assessment and the tagging pilots is already well underway. And as part of the evaluation, we're going to be engaging with stakeholders on the improvements made and their priorities for future iterations of the new strategic integrated impact assessment. And the findings from that evaluation will directly inform and strengthen our approach for the next budget for 27-28. And that will, I think the plans for publication are to be confirmed post-election. So it will be there for new government coming in good time for the next budget cycle.
Just one very brief supplementary, if it's okay, Convener. In terms of, will that be fed back to the committee? In terms of what the review actually looks like.
Well, yeah, I mean, we can make sure it is.
That would be quite useful for the new committee to kind of pick up if that's okay. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Rhoda Grant, please. Oh. Apologies. Is it Marie?
Oh,
We can't hear. I thought Rhoda had indicated. No, there's no sound. No sound. Marie, can we try and bring you in? Is your sound working?
My sound's working.
Oh, Rhoda,
now.
we have you.
Apologies,
Thanks,
I couldn't unmute, and my host just has disallowed. Obviously, someone was snoozing somewhere. Apologies. I just wanted to really ask about whether this will the assessments will impact at all, because, for instance, I've watched closely island impact assessments, which is being rolled up into the new system. I can't think of one thing that looks like it has changed due to those assessments. So it'd be really good to have maybe an example of where a practical change has happened in the way things are funded under the new system.
Okay, I'll bring officials in maybe a little bit more of the detail, but I guess because, as I said in one of my earlier answers, the thing that has changed is about making sure that at decision-making points, ministers have the impacts and the tagging in front of them to be able to influence decisions that they are making before they are made. So I guess what we would have to do is to make sure that we can perhaps record where, and it is a fair point, record where ministers may have made one decision, but they make another because of that evidence that's now part of their decision-making process that wasn't there before. So it's a bit like trying to because it's not going to be changed after the event, it would be changed as part of that decision-making process. So I'll maybe bring Simon in just about, are we capturing that, Simon, in terms of, examples of where ministers have made decisions based on what's in front of them? I'll bring you in.
Yep, thank you. So, as the Cabinet Secretary says, what we have published is an assessment of the draft budget and the decisions therein. So as part of that, we have looked at the final decisions and the impact they have had. Throughout the process, there's obviously been intermediate staging posts, so we've provided assessments and advice to ministers about the implications of some of their changes or some of their choices and what these may mean for different groups, whether that be island communities or other groups. We haven't included in the final assessment that sort of summary of where choices and decisions have been made as part of that allocative process. But I think that's a sort of issue which we will be capturing as part of a review in terms of what are the wider issues that users and stakeholders would find most useful, and that's something which we could look to embed in the process going forwards.
Yeah, well, we'll certainly take that away.
I just wanted to bring up, perhaps this might help to give a wee example. For instance, the child poverty tagging pilot study, it found that high impact lines span multiple portfolios, as you said, and they cluster around a small number of primary child poverty drivers, including social security, household income support, income from employment and parental employability, early learning, childcare. So that gives you an indication of how cross-portfolio you can start to track things. I think the other issue to remember about budget tagging is what we want. While we want to follow the money, absolutely, what we should be mindful of is making sure that we prioritise the areas that we can have the biggest impact in. And I mentioned child poverty because that's one of the key drivers for this government to tackle that. And we need to make sure that we consider the tagging and the evidence from that quite deeply and make sure that we scrutinise it rigorously so that we can have that better outcome and evidence that outcome better. My concern would be that we would be asked to sort of like budget tag everything, and then I think that the effect would be diluted.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now move on to questions from Maureen McNair, please.
Thank you, convener. My questions are actually been covered, under strategic and integrated impacts. So they're done. Cheers.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll now move on to questions on CARM, and we have Pam Gossel.
Thank you, convener. Thank you, convener. There are 800,000 working age people in Scotland who are economically inactive, up by 20,000 from the previous year. That is about 22% of the population. We have even heard examples of people refusing pay rises and promotions because this would mean that they will no longer be receiving benefits. Benefits are supposed to be a temporary solution, helping people back into work. But it seems that this government is encouraging people to stay out of work instead of making people reliant on benefits. Shouldn't the government's priority be to help these people enter and remain in the workplace?
Yeah, so of course work is the best way out of poverty, and the supports that are provided through Social Security Scotland are there to support people. Of course, many people in work are also getting the supports because it's about lifting children out of poverty. And had we not put in place the Scottish Child Payment and the other family supports that children receive, then we would not be the only part of the UK to see falling child poverty rates. That just hasn't happened by accident. It's happened because we've put the funding in to measures like the Scottish Child Payment and the other family benefits that are actively supporting families, helping to put food on the family table. And to take those away would then mean that we would not be heading towards meeting our child poverty statutory measures, which of course we need to do so by 2030, something of course the whole Parliament signed up to doing. So the Scottish Child Payment is an absolutely key part of that. But we also, of course, provide funding to employability services for the very point of getting parents back into work. So the draft budget, which of course will only pass if people vote for it, protects the government's investment in employability services at £90 million for 26-27. That will enable local employability partnerships to continue to support people experiencing barriers to employment. So it will support up to 7,500 people into work, including parents, and many more to achieve positive outcomes. We have analysed that the £270 million of employability funding over the course of the spending review period is anticipated to help over 22,000 people into work and support many more to progress towards employment. In addition to that, of course, we also have a new fund of £8 million that Colleges Scotland bid for colleges to support parents again who are needing support to get back into the labour market, because colleges are a good place that doesn't have some of the barriers associated with it. It's a non-threatening environment for parents and a supportive environment for parents to be able to access skills and training to go back into work. And of course, in addition, we have No One Left Behind, which provides a range of employability support to 8,532 parents, including single parents who are predominantly women. So I think we have a good track record of supporting people into employment. And of course, those resources will be in front of people to support at the budget process.
Sorry, could I just add disabled people? Yes. I just wanted to mention that as well. So, you know, we know that disabled people face sort of significant structural barriers to employment, and that we need to do more to support those individuals to make sure that they enter and remain in sustainable sort of employment opportunities. So with regards to our programme for government commitment, and our commitment to have the disability employment gap, specialist employability support for disabled people is now in place across all 32 local authorities to ensure that more disabled people and those with long-term health conditions can accessible that fair and sustainable work. The Cabinet Secretary mentioned the No One Left Behind, and we have seen progress in that. I'm referring just to the disabled people's bit in that. Through the local employability partnerships, the time covered is 23 to 24. 27% of participants reported being disabled and 40% reported at least one long-term health condition. And by 24-25, those figures had risen to 33% and 46% respectively. So there has been an improvement there, but absolutely I accept that there is more to do, but I hope that gives an indication that the trends are showing real progress in reaching and supporting disabled people.
Thank you for those responses. Whilst I absolutely agree, benefits are there and they're very important for those people that really, really need it. But however, it's out there in the public domain. You've heard that the fact that pay rises have been refused because their benefits would be impacted. I want to understand from the Minister and the Cabinet Secretary what their thinking is around this, because it's so important for those people that can work. We get them off the benefits because it's not sustainable, the benefit bill is, going forward. So it's important we get them off the benefits that can work and get them into work. So I'd like to understand from both yourselves, if it's, if you can answer that one, how do you see that working? I know that you've said you've put money into certain funds, but how do you see it working and how do you follow basically that funding, that money put in to say that these people are coming off? Because I've just said earlier on that there was a 20,000 rise from the previous year of 800,000 working age people who are economically inactive. That's 22% of the population. It's quite a lot. How do you see this come next year when we come back here and we're talking about the budget again? That how do you see the difference, and can you say that surely the difference will be made, that these figures will go down and those that need benefits will definitely get the benefits, but those that don't need the benefits and can work, that they will be in work?
Well, I've just outlined the programme and the funding put in place to support 22,000 people into work through those programmes. So there is good evidence that the employability programmes are working to support people, and of course the wraparound childcare, additional extending the school day, all of the other elements in the budget that people can vote for are there to make sure that parents are supported to be able to take on employment or indeed additional hours because of those supports around the school day. I'm going to write to the committee because I think the examples that are being quoted here are from a report where there were anecdotal examples of that have been quoted in the chamber that Pam Gosal has just repeated. But my understanding of that report, and I will write to the committee to confirm this, was that it did not find evidence that social security supports were systematically being barriers to people going into work. So the overall conclusions of the report, while there were some anecdotal examples, did not support the contention that Pam Gosal is making here, that there is a systematic problem of people on taking the Scottish Child Payment for one, and because they get the Scottish Child Payment are not going into work. Many people getting the Scottish Child Payment are already in work. And we should remember that. I don't think we lift and eradicate child poverty and lift children out of poverty by making it more difficult for them to access supports and to put a two-child cap in place, which I know Pam Gosal supports. I think the evidence to that would turn our success of reducing child poverty, the only part of the UK to do so. I think it would turn that around and we would see increasing levels of child poverty, and that is completely the opposite direction from what our government want to see, because at the end of the day we're talking about kids here and supporting kids, and for me that's the most important thing.
Thank you, Convener. I've said what I've said, yeah.
Thank you. Maggie Chapman, please.
Thanks very much, Convener. If I can just come back in on some of the work the committee did with the Commission advocating for minority rights. Firstly, that I think I come at this from the point of view that social security is very clearly there for all of us, because poverty damages everyone, not just those it directly affects, and that individuals' worth isn't measured by their ability to contribute economically to society, or at least shouldn't be worth, just valued in that way. Having said that, and what you've already said, Cabinet Secretary, some of the, I think there is a little bit of a disjoint. The members of CALM that we engaged with on employability specifically didn't recognise either the excellent tagging of employability services or the positive outcomes that you've identified. I appreciate some people clearly have received those positive outcomes, but the CALM members haven't, and they feel that actually there isn't the evidence necessarily that the Scottish Government is meeting its minimum core obligations in this. And I suppose I'm interested not so much in that point for now, but given the case study approach work that the committee has done, given this sort of ongoing engagement we've had with CALM, with its members on employability, that hasn't really, or it doesn't seem to have had that much, it hasn't featured in the budget approach of the government this year. Could you say a little bit more about how you have taken, or if you have taken, the work that committee has done with CALM, where that's had an impact on decisions that have been made on, or on how some of that restructuring we were talking about earlier, where's the throughput of that evidence that committee gathered?
So I think that the recommendations that you're referring to relate to the employability case study, which sort of provided, detailed recommendations on those specific areas. I think in my letter to the committee, by you I mean the royal you, on the 19th of January, responding to this committee's pre-budget report, and that did lay out sort of like my detailed answer to those specific recommendations. However, you know, I've got the opportunity to highlight a few key points from that letter. So, firstly, we now have a national customer charter that's been co-designed with people with lived experience of employability support, and that sets consistent service expectations across all 32 LEPs. Secondly, the refreshed local employability partnership framework has made clear that those LEPs are required to undertake the design of services with lived experience involvement in line with our wider commitment through employability policy to embed the Scottish approach to service design. And finally, our employability strategic plan of 2024 to 27 sets out our commitment to develop a national evaluation plan and effective ways to ensure that the voice of lived experience informs that continuous improvement, both at national and at local level. So, as part of that, we've also recently commissioned independent research to explore the experiences of people who have access services that are funded through the No One Left Behind Fund. And that project is scheduled to be completed during summer 2026. And that will help to shape policy and development and delivery of employability services. So, you know, the principle of participation is really, really important to us. And of course, you know, we're just headed off to a very important participatory process with the Disabled People's Organisations takeover of Cabinet, and that we're hoping to build on, because previously we've had the Children and Young People's takeover of Cabinet as well, where they've been able to directly represent their views early enough in a process in order to influence the decision making.
I appreciate that all you've said, Minister, but I suppose the evidence we collected from the CALM members is that actually there isn't that there isn't that positive outcome that you're describing. And I suppose just one issue with, you know, you said you've commissioned more research to be completed by the summer. I think there's already lots of evidence out there. You know, there's already a lot of information out there, a lot of information that this committee has gathered in our approach to equalities and human rights budgeting over the last 4.5 years. And I think there's a degree of frustration that, oh, we'll just gather more research rather than getting on and changing things for the better, particularly thinking of some of the joined upness. So you can have the best service in the world, employability service, but if you can't afford the bus to get there, it's no good to you. So you know, there are lots of different things that go into this, and I appreciate it's a work in process, but I think maybe something for this committee in future to hear from government about that direct read through of the project we undertook in the session with CALM, how that has a material impact in your decision making.
Yeah, I'm totally. I get that frustration. I absolutely understand it, and that's why I think things like cabinet takeovers, when you've got all the portfolios and the people responsible for those portfolios in the room at the same time, those crossovers that you mentioned, that example of the bus and employability, I think that's a massive step. Is to have all the people in the room. I mean, part of my role, which I've talked about at the committee before, and that the Cabinet Secretary mentioned as well as the Equalities, is to make sure that people are coming out of their silos and they get the best information possible. And that is knowing that impacts in one budget line can have an impact in another one.
Can I just add to that? And if you look at the whole family wellbeing funding being brought together, and some of it's yet to be announced as part of the Child Poverty Delivery Plan, one of the recognitions there is exactly that point. What are the barriers to someone getting into work? Sometimes it is the skills and training, confidence, all of that, but it sometimes can be a bus fare or childcare not being flexible enough. And the attempt there is to wrap services around the person, around the family, around the parent, around what are the barriers, and if it is a bus fare, then is there a way of a bus pass for the first year, and so on. So real practical considerations as to what the barriers are. But let me just reassure you, whether it's the work with CARM or others, we reflect on all of that. It's not just our own bit of research over here. We look at all of that, and if there are improvements that can be made in the light of these sessions, then of course we want to reflect on it. I mean, I'm already reflecting on, for example, whether using the terms exceptional, sound like marking our own homework that we think all the services are exceptional, when actually it's about the budget line description of exceptional impact. And maybe we need to be a bit clearer around that, because I could see why people might be like, well, that's not my experience. So I think we will take that away and just think about whether or not the language and just being really clear that there is what we're talking about here are budget lines rather than outcomes for everyone, and everybody's going to have different experiences and some better outcomes than others. So I think we'll probably reflect on the language. But just to give you that assurance.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And that brings our budget evidence session to a close. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance today. We will now suspend briefly for a changeover of witnesses. Thank you. Welcome back. We will now move on to our next item of business, which is consideration of the following two draft affirmative instruments. Criminal Legal Aid and Assistance by way of representation, Miscellaneous Amendments Scotland Regulations 2026 draft, Legal Aid and Advice and Assistance, Miscellaneous Amendments Scotland Regulations 2026 draft. I welcome to the meeting Siobhan Brown, Minister for Victims and Community. The Minister is accompanied today by Kieran MacDonald, Legal Aid Reform Team Leader, Conor Duffy, Legal Aid Reform Manager, and Martin Brown, Lawyer from the Scottish Government's Legal Directorate. You're all very welcome. Thank you for attending this morning. I refer members to papers 3 and 4 and invite the Minister to speak to the two draft instruments.
Good morning, Committee, and thank you, Convener. These SSIs form part of the Scottish Government's programme on legal aid reform, which aims to strengthen access to justice and ensure the system remains fair and sustainable for those who need it most. They were developed in partnership with the Scottish Legal Aid Board, and I'd like to express my thanks for their valuable contribution. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to the profession for its thoughtful and constructive engagement throughout the consultation. The Law Society and the Scottish Solicitors Bar Association have expressed broad support for these regulations. Access to justice is a fundamental right, and we want to ensure people get the help that they need and that there are solicitors available to provide it. That is why we have embarked on making these changes to Scotland's legal aid system, changes that will make a real difference to people's lives whilst ensuring the system works better for legal professionals. The Criminal Legal Aid and Assistance by way of representation miscellaneous amendment regulations will improve access to justice in criminal cases by simplifying legal aid processes, standardising eligibility and ensuring fair and sustainable remuneration for solicitors. For solemn cases that are resolved by a plea of guilty at any date prior to trial, the regulations provide that the preparation fee payable will be the same as for the cases disposed of under Section 76 of the Criminal Procedure Scotland Act 1995. This means that the fee will be the same in all circumstances when an accused person has a plea of guilty accepted at a date prior to trial, recognising the preparation and the negotiation work done to resolve the case without full trial proceedings. This incentivises early resolution where appropriate and maintains fairness in payment structures for solicitors. For summary criminal cases, the regulations will remove the provision of assistance by way of representation and establish summary criminal legal aid as the default form of legal aid. And this will be available in any case, regardless of the plea tendered by an accused at the first calling of the case in court. This will remove administrative hurdles that ensure timely access to representation for those most in need. The regulations will also remove the payment differential between the remuneration for duty solicitors and the wider fixed payment regime, so the fee structure supports fair payment no matter who is acting for the accused. Convener, the Legal Aid and Advice Assistance Miscellaneous Amendment Regulations will strengthen support for children within the Children's Hearing System. Children's Hearing Scotland, Scottish Children's Reporter Administration and Citizen Advice Scotland have expressed broad support for these regulations. Children applying for assistance by way of representation or ABWA will no longer need to pass income or merit tests to be eligible for support. It will automatically be available. A grant of ABWA will also be extended to last from an instigation hearing until a full compulsory supervision order is made or the hearing is discharged. The initial authorised expenditure limit for solicitors will rise substantially from £135 to £550, reducing the number of applications solicitors need to submit, thus improving efficiencies. Importantly, care leavers in receipt of the £2,000 care leaver payment will not have this counted as income or capital when assessing their eligibility, therefore reducing financial barriers care leavers may face. Overall, these changes will reduce administrative work for the Scottish Legal Aid Board and for solicitors. It will provide greater certainty of representation for children and lessen the need to reassess their financial circumstances. This is expected to have a direct positive impact on trauma-informed service delivery. Convener, while reforms proposed block fees in adults with incapacity cases were considered, we will not progress these changes at this time. It was clear when we had the consultation that more work with stakeholders is needed to find the correct balance when applying for block fees for these cases. The Scottish Government acknowledges these concerns and the Committee's recommendations from the recent Civil Legal Aid inquiry, and is committed to ensuring that any amendments align with forthcoming legislative reform in this area to enhance their effectiveness and sustainability. Further engagement will be key to achieving that, and it is important that any changes are taken forward in a coherent and a comprehensive way. In summary, Convener, these changes reaffirm our commitment to modernising legal aid, driving forward public efficiency and ensuring that every pound of public funding delivers maximum impact in providing access to justice for everyone in Scotland. And I'm happy to take any questions that the committee might have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Minister. We now have some questions from members, and we'll go to Tess White, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. Thank you for acknowledging that our recommendations from the committee weren't included. So that would have been my first question. And as a committee, we did note that the proposed changes from this committee were not taken forwards in relation to civil legal aid. So you have given a short explanation why our recommendations weren't taken forward, so saying that you need to do more work. But do you acknowledge the significant and serious concerns, and notable the Govan Law Centre and in my own area, one of our leading law firms, who the bulk of their work is to do with adults with incapacity, and the rates, there were concerns raised about the rates being too low and the very, very poor consultation from the Scottish Legal Aid Board. So in your work, admittedly we've only got sort of less than 2 months to go, but will you be looking at this before the end of the parliamentary term, or is it something you'll can kick down the road into next parliamentary term? And do you accept the points that we made about the rates being too low, the bureaucracy being too high, and the Scottish Legal Aid Board's poor consultation with key stakeholders? Thank you.
Yes, I thank Ms White for her comments. I think one of the things that members will be aware of, that the legal aid reform legislation wasn't possible to take forward in this parliamentary term, and just over a year ago I made a commitment that I will do everything I can within the next 18 months before this Parliament finishes to do the secondary legislation, which is what's being brought forward here today. The adults with incapacity, after engagement with stakeholders, it was divided on both sides, and that's why we are not taking that forward at the moment. I've had conversations with leading solicitors who take on that work as well to listen to their concerns. So I think that's where we've taken a decision to pause. It will not be taken forward in the next 6 weeks, and it will have to go forward in the next parliamentary term.
And thank you, Minister. But did you hear the feedback that the rates are too low and that they're becoming loss leaders for law firms, and law firms, even now, they're in a crisis mode, and the most vulnerable in our society, adults with incapacity, feel that they're being left behind?
Yes, I did hear. I heard that. I heard in the response, and I might bring in someone else as well, but in the responses to that, it was divided 50-50. I think half were actually going to be getting more money, and half felt they weren't making enough money. And this is where we have to pause, and we have to do more consultation. But I have met with solicitors doing that work. So yes, I've taken that all on board, and it's just unfortunate that we're not able to have time frame to progress things.
Thank you. And just the Scottish Legal Aid Boards, during our debate, there was huge criticism of the way they operated in their poor consultation. Has that been heard as well?
That has been heard. I meet regularly with them, and I see as we move forward into the next parliamentary term, when we look at legal aid reform. It's a big picture. There's lots of work that has been done in the last 12 months on this that I might be able to touch on it with another question. But I also see reform within the Scottish Legal Aid Board having to happen in the next parliamentary term, which they're open to as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. Back to you, Convener.
Thank you. Rhoda Grant, please.
Thank you, Convener. Just an overarching question, I guess, on all the instruments. In rural areas and in the Highlands and Islands that I represent, there are legal aid deserts. People are having to go from Highland to Glasgow to get a solicitor to represent them in all sorts of cases. And I wonder if any of those changes are going to make a difference, taking account of geography, the additional costs of travel and the like, to make it easier for local solicitors to take on this work and represent folk more locally.
I know that Ms Grant has raised this with me several times regarding availability of solicitors, which is something that it does concern me, and this is why this work is so vital moving forward, because we have had engagement with solicitors to how do we make legal aid work more attractive, and by simplifying the process with what I'm bringing forward today is through the engagement with solicitors as well. So I do think it will simplify it and probably hopefully make things more attractive. I do recognise that there are challenges within geographically, which I know that there's work being done on that. I don't know if Rhoda Grant is aware that as of last week or the week before, there has been an agreement for a 13% uplift in legal aid fees, which will come into place in September this year. I've also set up a fee mechanism review group, which will annually review legal aid increases. And also we are looking at 40 traineeship places with IT. So we're doing everything we can to work with the profession to enable it to be more lucrative or for solicitors to take on legal aid, which hopefully will help in our rural areas.
Would you look at rural proofing, future policy, just having a look through the lens of kind of rural areas where it's really difficult to get that access to legal representation?
Yes, sorry, I didn't pick up the first thing you said. What was it? Look at...
just to rural proof.
Rural proof. Yes, well, I think that could be taken on board. I think it probably does need to be taken on board as we move forward with the legal aid reform.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. We now have a question from Maggie Chapman, please.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, Minister. Thanks for joining us this morning. I suppose, again, my question isn't on the detail of the instruments before us, but I suppose on the consequences, or given what you said, both in response to Tess White and Rhoda Grant, and given, I think, all of our wish that we'd managed to progress legal aid reform more comprehensively in this parliamentary term, it would be really, really useful if we could, before the end of this term, have a kind of this is what is happening, and this is what is still to do from the government's point of view, because we know that we will need legislation, but there are other things that won't require legislation that we could be getting on with, some of which we are getting on with already. But I think having that brought together would be really, really valuable, because what you've just talked about there, you know, the fee review group, the trainee places, I think that's all really, really positive news. But what I'm concerned about is, because we don't have a chunk of time to spend on this as we would in a bill process, that the piecemeal bits don't actually all end up fitting together effectively. So just an initial response from you, but really a request. Could we have this is what's happening, this is what's still to do, this is what we still, how everything pulls together?
Yeah, no, and I think that makes sense, because there has been a lot of work done in the last 12 months. We are moving into the next 6 weeks of Parliament, and we know that any legal aid reform bill will take time. Nothing happens quickly. So I'm happy to take that away and speak to officials, that if we can maybe provide the committee with the timeline of what we've done.
That would be really helpful.
And then what could maybe be done in the next parliamentary session, secondary legislation-wise, because I think there's work that can be accelerated without legislation and then look at the bigger picture of the legal aid reform bill in the next Parliament. But I'll take that away and I will write to the committee if that's all right.
Really appreciate that. Thank you. Thanks, Karen.
Okay, thank you. Our next agenda item is consideration of the motions for approval on the affirmative instruments. I invite the Minister to move the following motions. S6M 2070 that the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee recommends that the draft criminal legal aid and assistance by way of representation miscellaneous amendment Scotland Regulation 2026 be approved, and S6M 2021-6 that the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee recommends that the draft legal aid and advice and assistance miscellaneous amendment Scotland Regulations 2026 be approved.
Move, Convener.
Thank you. Minister, do members have any comments to make? If not, are we all agreed? Agreed. Okay, that is agreed. Thank you. We will now suspend briefly for a change of officials for consideration of our third draft affirmative instrument this morning as per the agenda. Welcome back. Our next item of business is consideration of our third and final draft affirmative instrument this morning. First Tier Tribunal for Scotland Local Taxation Chamber Rules of Procedure and Composition Miscellaneous Amendment Regulations 2026 draft. I therefore welcome again to the meeting Siobhan Brown, Minister for Victims and Community. The Minister is accompanied this time by Mandy Williams, Unit Head of Tribunals and Judicial Policy, and Rachel Nicholson, lawyer from the Scottish Government's Legal Directorate. I invite the Minister to speak to the draft instrument.
Thank you very much, Convener. Following on from the two legal aid regulations, and I would now like to speak to the committee regarding the First Tier Tribunal for Scotland Local Taxation Chamber regulations laid before you today. First Tier Tribunal for Scotland Local Taxation Chamber Rules of Procedure and Composition Miscellaneous Amendments Regulation 2026 in draft. For context, the Scottish tribunal structure was created by the Tribunals Scotland Act 2014, which introduced a new and a simplified statutory framework for tribunals in Scotland. The Scottish tribunals consist of the First Tier Tribunal and the Upper Tribunal. The First Tier Tribunal is organised into a series of chambers which have specialist jurisdictions. There are currently 6 chambers: the General Regulatory, the Tax, Housing and Property, Local Taxation, Health and Education and Social Security. The purpose of this draft amending instrument is to make technical amendments to the procedure rules and composition rules applicable to the Local Taxation Chamber, also known as the LTC. The LTC considers various appeals related to non-domestic rates, NDR, water charges, civil penalties, and also council tax matters. The purpose of the amendments to the procedure rule is to insert reference to the Valuations, Proposals, Procedures Scotland Regulations 2025, which will come into force on the 1st of April 2026, and make provision as to the making of proposals by proprietors, tenants and occupiers of land and heritage for alteration of entries in the valuation roll for the non-domestic rates. In addition, the draft instrument will also allow an appellant to withdraw an appeal without first requiring a request to withdraw to be made to the LTC. The amendments to the composition regulations seek to provide a non-exhaustive list of procedural or incidental matters which can be considered by the single legal member, judicial member or the chamber president of the LTC sitting alone. I consulted with the President of the Scottish Tribunals on the drafting amending instrument in line with the requirements of the Tribunals Scotland Act 2014, and the draft amending instrument has been adjusted further to this engagement. I understand that DPLRC committee considered these regulations on the 13th of January and had no points were raised by that committee. I appreciate these are very technical in detail, but I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'll bring my officials in if I can't answer them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Minister. Do any members have any comments or questions on the instrument? I see no indications. Thank you. We will now move on to agenda item 5, which is the formal debate in relation to the instrument. So, as previously mentioned, our 5th agenda item is consideration of the motion for approval on the affirmative instrument. I therefore invite the Minister to move the following motion, S6M 20225, that the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee recommends that the draft First-Tier Tribunal for Scotland Local Taxation Chamber Rules of Procedure and Composition Miscellaneous Amendment Regulation 2026 be approved.
Moved, Convener.
Thank you, Minister. Do members have any comments to make? If not, are we all agreed? Thank you. We are all agreed. Next, I invite members to delegate to me approval of the publication of a short factual report on our deliberations on the affirmative instruments that we have considered today. Are we all agreed? Thank you. We're all agreed. Therefore, that concludes our formal business in public this morning. I thank the Minister and our officials once again for joining us. We will now move into our private session to discuss the remaining items on our agenda. Thank you.